Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going way back, back to 19th century India, to explore all those fascinating socio-religious reform movements that really shaped the nation. If you're prepping for the UPSC, this is going to be especially useful for you for your GS1 Modern Indian History prep on this very topic. But even if you're just a history buff, stick around. You're in for a treat. Before we get started, though, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Okay, so let's unpack this era. Imagine India in the 1800s, a time of massive change under British rule where new ideas were constantly clashing with old traditions. This period saw tons of reform movements, all aiming to modernize Indian society. And that's what we're going to explore today.
Right.
To help us navigate this historical labyrinth, we've got our expert here with us today who can help us connect the dots and explain the why behind the what. Ready to get started?
Absolutely. It's super important to understand that these reform movements didn't just, appear out of nowhere. They were a response to the complex realities of 19th century India.
Okay.
British colonialism, as oppressive as it was, also inadvertently exposed Indians to Western ideas, ideas like democracy, individual liberty, and rationalism.
Right.
And these sparked a desire for change, especially among the emerging Indian middle class, who were, they were becoming increasingly aware of all the social issues that were plaguing their society.
Okay, so British colonialism kind of inadvertently planted the seeds of change.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
It is. Think about it. Exposure to Western education and literature led many Indians to start questioning traditional practices, and they started to see the need for social reform. The contrast between Indian and Western societies became really apparent, highlighting areas where India was lagging behind, especially when it came to women's rights and the rigidity of the caste system.
So this clash between traditional Indian values and Western thought basically created the perfect breeding ground for all these reform movements.
Exactly. And there's another key factor that fueled these movements, and that was the freedom of the press, ironically granted by the British. This allowed reformers to voice their ideas, critique existing norms, and reach a wider audience through publications. It was a really powerful tool for social awakening.
Wow. So the British kind of inadvertently handed the reformers a megaphone. It's incredible how history often works in these unexpected ways.
It is. And speaking of reformers using the press to their advantage, one name that really stands out is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a true pioneer of his time.
Oh, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, often called the father of modern India. I've heard his name so many times, but I'd love to really understand why he's considered such a pivotal figure.
Yeah, he was really a bridge connecting the East and the West. He seamlessly blended the best of both worlds. He believed in reason, and he looked to the Vedas and Upanishads to purify Hinduism, advocating for monotheism and challenging practices like sati.
Wait, so he was advocating for change within Hinduism itself? I always thought these reform movements were about rejecting traditional beliefs altogether.
Not necessarily. Many reformers like Roy aimed to reform their own religions from within. In fact, he even established the Brahmo Samaj in 1828, which sought to remove corrupt practices and promote a more rational and ethical form of Hinduism.
So it was about reinterpreting tradition in a way that aligned with modern values?
Precisely.
Yeah.
But reform is rarely a smooth sailing process. Roy faced strong opposition from orthodox groups like the Dharma Sabha, who fiercely defended traditional Hindu practices. It was a real clash between those who clung to the past and those who yearned for a more progressive future.
I can imagine. It must have taken incredible courage to challenge those deeply ingrained traditions.
It did. And Roy's courage really paved the way for future reformers. His commitment to modern education was another testament to his vision. He understood that education was key to transforming society, which led him to establish institutions like Hindu College and Vedanta College, where Western science and philosophy were taught alongside traditional subjects. He envisioned a complete societal transformation, not just religious reform.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
He wasn't content with just tweaking the edges.
Yeah.
He wanted to revolutionize the very fabric of Indian society.
Yeah.
But let me guess, his progressive ideas didn't exactly sit well with everyone, did they?
You're absolutely right. Roy's advocacy for change, especially his criticism of sati, led to some intense debates and a lot of opposition from those who clung to tradition.
Right.
The Dharma Sabha, in particular, emerged as a strong voice of resistance, arguing that tampering with ancient customs would erode the very fabric of Hinduism.
So it was a real battle of ideas, a tug of war between tradition and reform. And in the middle of all of this, Roy was forging ahead, pushing for change. Even when faced with fierce resistance, that takes real conviction.
It does. And Roy wasn't alone in this endeavor. Many others took up the mantle of reform, each contributing their own unique perspectives and strategies to this larger movement.
Okay, so this is where it starts to get really interesting.
It does. One such figure was Henry Vivian de Rosio, a charismatic young man who spearheaded the Young Bengal movement.
Okay.
This movement was known for its radical approach, advocating for complete social and political reform, including women's rights and the abolition of caste distinctions.
Wow. The Young Bengal movement. They sound like the rebels of the reform movement.
Yeah.
Huh.
They were passionate, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. De Rosio, in particular, was a powerful orator who inspired his students to think critically and question traditional norms. His influence, though, was short-lived as he died at a very young age.
Oh, a tragic loss for the movement, I imagine.
It was. But his ideas continue to resonate and inspire future generations of reformers. Another key figure was Debendranath Tagore, who carried forward Roy's legacy and established the Tatva Bhutini Sabha. This organization played a vital role in promoting education and indigenous culture, while advocating for social reform within the framework of Hinduism.
So we're seeing these different approaches to reform emerging, some like the Young Bengal movement pushing for radical change, while others like Tagore advocating for a more gradual transformation within existing structures.
Exactly, and this diversity of approaches is really what makes this period so fascinating. It wasn't a monolithic movement, it was more like a tapestry woven from these different strands of thought and action.
And each strand contributing to this larger picture of a more just and equitable society. So who else stands out in this tapestry of reformers?
Well, there's Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, a champion of women's education, who played a pivotal role in the passage of the landmark Widows' Remarriage Act of 1856. This act was a major victory for social justice, allowing Hindu widows to remarry, which had been prohibited by traditional customs.
That's incredible. Imagine the societal shift that must have caused challenging those deeply entrenched patriarchal norms.
Absolutely. Vidyasagar was a tireless advocate for women's rights, and his work had a profound impact on improving their lives. And then there's this remarkable duo, Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule, who dedicated their lives to challenging the caste system and championing the rights of the marginalized Shit.
The Fools. Now, those are names that I've definitely come across while studying the history of social justice movements in India. But tell me what made them such powerful forces for change.
They were true pioneers in the fight against caste discrimination. Jyotiba Phule, for instance, coined the term Dalit to refer to those who were considered untouchable. And outside the caste system, he saw the caste hierarchy as inherently oppressive, and he argued for complete social equality.
So he was directly confronting the very foundation of social hierarchy in India, a system that had been in place for centuries. That's incredibly bold.
It was. And Savitribai, his wife, was equally passionate about challenging the status quo. She established schools for girls and lower caste children, understanding that education was crucial for empowerment and social mobility.
Education as a weapon against oppression.
Yeah.
A tool for liberation.
Yeah.
I love that. And I've heard stories about Savitribai's incredible activism. Didn't she even organize a barber strike?
You're absolutely right. She organized a barber strike to protest the custom of shaving widows' heads, which was seen as this mark of shame enforced by social pressure. It was a brilliant example of using nonviolent resistance to challenge these discriminatory practices.
It's amazing to see how they combined social activism with a deep understanding of the power dynamics at play. They weren't just fighting for abstract ideals, they were tackling the everyday realities of oppression.
Exactly. And their work had this ripple effect, inspiring others to join the movement for social justice. For example, Balshastri Jambekar, a scholar and journalist, used his weekly publication, The Darpan, to critique Brahmanical orthodoxy and advocate for social reform.
The power of the pen, or in this case, the printing press. It's so fascinating how these reformers used every tool at their disposal to spread their message and challenge the status quo. And I'm sensing a theme here: education, social justice, and the use of media to amplify their voices. Am I right?
You're spot on. Those are definitely recurring themes in these reform movements of this era, and it's crucial to remember that these movements were gaining momentum just as India was undergoing this significant political and social upheaval. The events of 1858, specifically the transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown, further fueled the flames of change.
Oh, wow. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 and its aftermath.
Yeah.
That was such a turning point in Indian history. So how did this transfer of power impact the reform movements?
Well, the Sepoy Mutiny, though brutally suppressed, shook the foundations of British rule, and it sparked a wave of nationalism across India, and this newfound sense of national identity, coupled with this growing awareness of social injustices, gave a fresh impetus to all these reform movements.
It's like the mutiny served as a wake-up call, a reminder that things couldn't continue the way they were.
Exactly. And this period also saw the rise of new economic forces, the spread of education, and continued exposure to Western ideas. All of these factors contributed to a growing demand for change, making the ground fertile for even more reform movements to emerge.
This is where the plot thickens, doesn't
It
it?
does. And that brings us to two more iconic figures in this era of reform, Ramakrishna Paramhansa and his disciple Swami Vivekananda.
Ah, the dynamic duo. I've heard so much about them, especially Vivekananda's powerful speeches. But I'm curious to understand how they fit into this larger narrative of social and religious reform.
Well, they represent a really fascinating blend of spirituality and social action. Ramakrishna was a mystic who emphasized the unity of all religions, while Vivekananda, with his incredible charisma and oratory skills, took that message to the world. He established the Ramakrishna mission, which blended spiritual teachings with social service, creating this powerful force for positive change.
Okay, so they weren't just about personal enlightenment. They were about putting those spiritual principles into action to actually uplift society.
Exactly. And Vivekananda in particular was this fierce critic of the stagnation and social ills that he saw within Hinduism. He famously said, "Our religion is in the kitchen, our God is the cooking pot, and our religion is, don't touch me, I am holy."
Wow. That's a powerful indictment of the ritualistic practices and social divisions that were plaguing Hinduism at that time.
Yeah.
So he was calling for a more dynamic and inclusive approach to religion, one that actively addressed the needs of society.
Exactly. He believed that true spirituality should translate into tangible actions that actually benefit humanity. And that's what made the Ramakrishna mission so impactful.
So we're seeing a shift here from movements that were focused solely on religious reform to those that embraced a more holistic approach, connecting spirituality with social action.
Absolutely. And this shift reflects the evolving nature of the reform movement itself. As India moved toward the 20th century, these movements became more diverse, addressing a wider range of issues and drawing inspiration from various sources, both indigenous and Western.
This is getting really fascinating. I could already see how understanding these early reform movements is essential for really grasping the broader social and political changes that shaped modern India.
You're right. These movements really laid the groundwork for many of the social and political reforms that would take place in the 20th century, including the fight for independence.
Okay, so this is where we pause for now, right? I'm already feeling overwhelmed with information, but in a good way.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical context that gave rise to these movements to the key figures who shaped their trajectory.
All right, listeners, stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dives, where we'll explore even more fascinating reform movements and delve deeper into their impact on Indian society. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 19th century Indian socio-religious reform movements. We've been exploring the context in which these movements emerged. And we've met some remarkable individuals like Raja Ram Mohan Roy the Fools and Swami Vivekananda, and their efforts to reform religion and society, sometimes gradually, paint this really vivid picture of India at a crossroads.
It's like watching a society grapple with its own identity, trying to reconcile tradition with the demands of a changing world. And if I remember correctly, we were just about to explore how this wave of reform extended beyond Hinduism and impacted other religious communities as well.
You're absolutely right. Remember, this was a pan-Indian phenomenon. Reform wasn't limited to just one community. So let's shift our focus and explore how this reformist spirit echoed within Islam, Sikhism, and even the Parsi community.
Okay, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's start with Islam. What were some of the key movements that emerged within the Muslim community during this era?
Well, within Islam, a really powerful movement emerged called the Wahhabi movement, led by Syed Ahmed Barelvi. They advocated for a return to the pure form of Islam as practiced during the Prophet Muhammad's time. They saw practices like the veneration of saints and elaborate rituals as deviations from the true faith.
So it was about stripping away layers of tradition and getting back to the essence of Islam as they saw it. But wasn't this also a time of British colonialism? Did the Wahhabis view the British presence as a threat to their faith?
Absolutely. The Wahhabis were staunchly opposed to British rule. They saw the British as a corrupting influence, both politically and religiously. They believed that true Muslims should resist colonial rule and strive to establish an Islamic state.
So the reformist zeal had a political edge to it. They saw the fight against British rule as intertwined with their quest for religious purity.
Exactly. And this resistance to British influence was a common thread in many reform movements across different religions. For instance, another influential movement within Islam was the Farisi movement, led by Shariatullah Khan and his son Dadu Mian.
Okay, the Farisi movement. Tell me more about them. What were their key concerns?
The Farisis focused on the practical aspects of Islamic life. They were deeply concerned about the exploitation of Muslim peasants by landlords, many of whom were Hindus. They encouraged their followers to strictly adhere to Islamic principles, including the payment of zakat, a form of almsgiving, and the avoidance of interest-based transactions.
So their focus was on empowering the Muslim community, both spiritually and economically.
You got it. They led anti-tax campaigns, urging peasants to resist paying taxes to the British and landlords, who they saw as unjust. They also promoted self-sufficiency and encouraged Muslims to engage in trade and agriculture.
It sounds like they were building a parallel society, one that was rooted in Islamic principles and aimed at resisting both colonial and economic oppression.
That's a great way to put it. The Farisis, like the Wahhabis, saw their struggle as a fight for both religious and social justice. But within Islam, there were also reform movements that took a different approach, emphasizing modern education and reconciliation with Western thought.
Oh, that's interesting. So there wasn't a single monolithic approach to reform within Islam. There were different schools of thought, each with its own vision for the future. Tell me more about these movements that embraced modern education.
One key figure in this regard was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the leader of the Aligarh movement. He believed that the Muslim community had fallen behind due to their resistance to modern education.
So he saw education as the key to progress, much like Rajaram Mohan Roy in the Hindu reform movement.
Exactly. Syed Ahmad Khan argued that Muslims needed to embrace Western science and technology. While remaining true to their Islamic faith, he believed that Islam and modern knowledge were not incompatible, but could actually complement each other. And to put his ideas into practice, he founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University.
Wow, he established a university. That's quite a legacy. So he wasn't calling for a rejection of Western ideas, but rather a selective adoption of those that could benefit the Muslim community.
Precisely. He saw modern education as essential for Muslims to compete in the changing world and gain political and economic power. His vision was to create a new generation of educated Muslims who could bridge the gap between tradition and modernity.
It's fascinating to see how these reform movements were adapting to the realities of colonialism, each finding its own way to navigate the challenges and opportunities of this era.
Absolutely. And this adaptability was also evident in the reform movements that emerged within Sikhism. Let's turn our attention to them now. Are you ready to explore the world of Sikh reform?
Absolutely. I'm eager to learn more about how these movements shaped the Sikh community. From what I know, Sikhism already had a strong emphasis on social justice and equality, so I'm curious to see how these reform movements built upon those existing values.
That's a great observation. Sikhism, from its inception, challenged the caste system and promoted the equality of all people. However, over time, some practices had crept in that deviated from those core principles. And these reform movements aimed to revive the true spirit of Sikhism and address the challenges facing the community in the 19th century.
So it was about getting back to the roots, purifying the faith from within. Tell me which movements were at the forefront of this Sikh reform.
One of the most prominent movements was the Singh Sabha movement, which emerged in the 1870s. They focused on promoting education, reviving Sikh traditions, and challenging social evils like caste discrimination and female infanticide.
So they were addressing both religious and social issues, much like the reform movements we've seen in other communities.
Exactly. They believed that true Sikhism encompassed both spiritual growth and social responsibility. They established Khalsa schools and colleges to provide quality education that was rooted in Sikh values. They also published religious texts and literature to spread awareness about Sikh principles.
It sounds like they were creating a strong foundation for the Sikh community, empowering them through education and reinforcing their cultural identity.
Precisely. They were also instrumental in reclaiming control of Gurdwaras Sikh temples, which had come under the influence of individuals who weren't really adhering to Sikh principles.
So they were fighting for autonomy within their own community, ensuring that their religious institutions reflected their values.
Absolutely. And alongside the Singh Sabha movement, another influential movement emerged called the Namdari movement, also known as the Kuka movement.
Okay, the Kuka movement. That name rings a bell. I think I've read about them being quite militant in their opposition to British rule. Is that right?
You're right, they were known for their fierce resistance to British influence. They advocated for a return to simple living, emphasized Sikh martial traditions, and wore white clothes as a symbol of purity. They even clashed violently with the British authorities on several occasions.
Wow. So they were a much more radical force compared to the Singh Sabha movement. It's fascinating to see these different approaches within the same community. Some advocating for reform through education and social work, while others choosing the path of armed resistance.
It really highlights the complex dynamics of this era and the diverse ways in which people responded to colonialism and the need for change. And it's important to note that even within the Sikh community, nonviolent resistance gained traction in the early 20th century with the emergence of the Akali movement.
Okay, so the Akali movement was more aligned with Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha.
You're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
The Akalis, while deeply religious, were also politically astute. They launched a nonviolent movement to reclaim control of gurdwaras from corrupt mahants or temple managers, who were often supported by the British.
So they were fighting for religious freedom and challenging the British influence within their own community.
Exactly. Their struggle resonated with the wider Indian population and became a significant part of the growing movement for independence.
It's amazing to see how these seemingly disparate movements, each with its own specific goals, were all contributing to this larger wave of change sweeping across India.
That's a great observation. And this wave of reform even touched the Parsi community, though they were a much smaller group compared to Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs.
All right, the Parsis, I know they were a relatively prosperous and well-educated community, often at the forefront of social and economic progress. What form did reform take within their community?
Within the Parsi community, one of the most notable organizations was the Ranumai Mazdayasan Sabha, which emerged in the late 19th century. This organization focused on promoting education, particularly for women, and on modernizing social customs, within the framework of Zoroastrianism, their faith.
So they were focused on adapting their traditions to the changing times, ensuring that their community remained progressive and relevant.
Exactly. They believed in reasoned social reform and the importance of aligning their religious practices with modern values.
It's fascinating to see how this reformist impulse cut across religious boundaries, uniting people from different communities in their pursuit of a more just and equitable society.
It really is. And as we delve deeper into this era, we see how these seemingly disparate movements were interconnected, influencing each other and contributing to a broader national awakening.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part, exploring the reform movements within Islam, Sikhism, and the Parsi community. It's incredible to see how each community grappled with the challenges and opportunities of this era, finding their own paths toward progress.
Yes. And in the next part, we'll delve deeper into the impact of these movements, analyzing their successes, limitations, and lasting legacy on Indian society.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've journeyed through this incredible landscape of 19th century Indian socio-religious reform movements and witnessed this just fervor for change that was sweeping across these different communities.
It's been fascinating, hasn't it?
It really has.
From the Brahma Samaj's push for a more rational Hinduism to the Aligarh movement's embrace of modern education for Muslims, we've seen how each community really tried to reconcile tradition with the demands of this rapidly changing world.
Yeah. And as we enter this final part of our deep dive, I'm really curious to understand the lasting impact of all these movements. Did they achieve their goals? What were some of their limitations? And how do their ideas continue to shape India today?
Those are really great questions. And they kind of lead us to the heart of what makes studying history so rewarding. Assessing the impact of these reform movements requires us to look beyond the immediate outcomes and consider their long-term consequences.
So it's about understanding how these movements basically planted seeds that would blossom in the years to come.
Exactly. One of the most significant impacts of these movements was the rise of social consciousness. They sparked this nationwide conversation about issues like caste discrimination, women's rights, the importance of education.
So they essentially broke the silence surrounding these issues, bringing them into the public sphere.
Exactly. And this shift in consciousness was crucial for paving the way for all the future social and political reforms that we see. For instance, the tireless efforts of reformers like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and the Fools to promote women's education, that laid the groundwork for greater female participation in society later on.
Right, and their work ultimately contributed to the fight for women's suffrage and equal rights in the 20th century.
Exactly. Similarly, the relentless critique of the caste system by reformers like Jyotiba Phule and the work of organizations like the Arya Samaj that contributed to the rise of Dalit consciousness and the movement for social justice.
So even though these movements might not have completely eradicated caste-based discrimination, they planted the seeds for future generations to kind of pick up that torch and continue the fight.
Absolutely. Their ideas became a powerful force for challenging social hierarchies and advocating for the rights of marginalized communities. And let's not forget the impact of these movements on education, the push for modern education. Championed by figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, that had a transformative effect on Indian society.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how education was really viewed as this tool for both individual and societal upliftment.
It was. It was seen as the key to progress empowerment and social mobility. And the establishment of institutions like Hindu College, Vedanta College, and Aligarh Muslim University, they played a pivotal role in shaping the intellectual landscape of modern India.
Yeah, and those institutions produced generations of leaders, thinkers, and reformers who would contribute to India's journey toward independence and beyond.
Absolutely. The reform movements also played a significant role in shaping Indian nationalism by challenging traditional norms and advocating for a more just and equitable society. They fostered this sense of unity and shared purpose among Indians of different religions and backgrounds.
So they were inadvertently laying the foundation for a national identity that transcended religious and regional differences.
Exactly. The movements instilled a sense of pride in Indian culture and history, while also encouraging people to critically examine traditional practices that might have been hindering progress.
It's fascinating to see how these seemingly disparate movements, each with its own specific goals, were all contributing to this larger national awakening. But it's also important to acknowledge that these movements weren't without their limitations.
You're absolutely right. One of the major criticisms leveled against these movements is that their impact was largely confined to urban areas and the educated elite.
Right, so the message of reform didn't quite reach the masses in rural India, where traditional social structures remained very deeply entrenched.
Exactly. The vast majority of the population living in villages remained largely untouched by these reform efforts. And there's also the argument that some of these movements, in their zeal to reform, sometimes ended up reinforcing certain traditional values or reinterpreting them in ways that didn't necessarily lead to greater social justice.
So it's a complex legacy, a mix of progress and limitations. It's about recognizing the achievements of these movements, while also being critical of their shortcomings.
Precisely. And it's also about understanding that social reform is this ongoing process. These 19th century movements planted seeds that would continue to grow and evolve in the following centuries. Their ideas inspired future generations of reformers and activists to continue the fight for a more just and equitable society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways that our listeners should keep in mind about this transformative era in Indian history?
Well, the 19th century reform movements represent this pivotal chapter in India's story. They reflect a society grappling with its identity, negotiating the complexities of tradition and modernity, and ultimately paving the way for a more progressive future. Their impact, while not without its limitations, was profound and continues to shape India today.
It's a reminder that history is not just about memorizing dates and events. What about understanding the ideas, the struggles, the triumphs that have shaped the world we live in? And for our UPSC aspirants out there, grasping the nuances of these movements is crucial for understanding the evolution of modern Indian society and polity.
Absolutely. These movements provide valuable insights into the social, religious, and political forces that have really shaped India, and studying them equips us to analyze contemporary issues with a deeper understanding of their historical roots.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners for joining us. And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. We encourage you to delve deeper into the rich history of these reform movements. Read the works of these remarkable reformers and critically examine their ideas in light of contemporary challenges.
There's always more to learn, more to question, and more to discover.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on future explorations. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts compassionate.